Let's talk about the secret to learning on the job. Undoubtedly, one of the things that you guys will find when you get on the job is that they have to teach you a lot more than what you already know. So we're building a foundation here, and we don't know what kind of house you're going to build on it. And so you're basically going to learn a lot on the job. Here's one of what I want to throw out to you. When you are looking at the amount of learning versus the time on the job, just in general rough ballpark numbers, you learn 80% of the job in the first 6 months. And then when you have this exponential decay in learning. And so I've been doing this job for 19 years now. Do you think I gain that much from one year to the next? Now, I'm always getting a little better, but it's not at nearly the rate that I was at the beginning. Now, what does this mean for you? There are 2 ways you can approach a career. You can try to jump into one thing and try to be the very, very, very best that you can be at that thing. I'm going to tell you that's probably not the best idea. Probably the best idea is to move around because you're not really growing all that much. Now, should you quit jobs every 6 months? Absolutely not. But one thing you can do when you're looking for jobs or within your company is to look for what are called rotational development programs. I was in a rotational development program, and we had 5 rotations. Each one was 6 months. And it was amazing how much difference that made and how much we learned. And I compare that to when I worked in nuclear power. I was there a semester at a time. And I made the mistake I did 4 tours at that place. And I made the mistake of always staying in the same unit and getting to know this one system really, really well. I should have been moving around and learning a little bit about everything. And there's a couple of reasons that you want to do that. First of all, what are the chances that they're going to have that job opening in that very special thing that you're doing? The second thing is you're a whole lot more flexible for when things change. For example, we used to have this classroom technology here called ITV, or interactive television. And we had a guy named Calvin, and he was wonderful at that, and he could make it sing. But then that technology became obsolete, outdated. But that was the only thing he knew. So what do you think happened? Yeah, that's basically the end of his career, right? And so I will always advise you to be a generalist rather than a specialist, because your opportunities for employment are much greater. And as Captain Barentine and I were discussing at the career fair, the hiring patterns have changed because of AI. So that's another reason to try to get yourself well versed in several areas, because maybe 2 or 3 of those areas might get taken over by AI, but not all of them will. Does that make sense? Okay. We were talking about inventory last time, and we said, first of all, we know we don't want to have too little inventory because we'll have stock out costs and we'll miss out on sales and we'll make our customers mad. But there's also the danger of too much inventory. And whenever I mention the dangers of too much inventory, the first thing people think about is the warehouse space and the cost to hold the goods in a warehouse. That's actually small potatoes compared to the money we have invested in the inventory itself. Keep in mind that inventory is a current asset and that we have to, at one point or another, have cash to be able to put that stuff on our shelves. And so any inventory we don't have to put on our shelves is cash that we don't have to spend. And it's perhaps cash we don't have to raise, so we don't have to borrow additional money from the bank. You'd be amazed at how many businesses run on short-term credit. You'd think that they could just build up and eventually get to where they don't need to keep borrowing money on a short term, but you see it over and over and over again. I grew up around farming, and it would always bug me senseless to see farmers have to take out a loan for seeds and diesel fuel to plant their fields. I'm like, you've been doing this 30 years and you don't have enough money set aside for seeds and diesel fuel? But that's how a lot of businesses work. Okay, so we're going to tie up our working capital. That's the first problem, and we've got a carrying cost for that. Then we've got spoilage. So spoilage, and when we talk about spoilage in manufacturing, we're talking about defects, but there are other ways to get spoilage. For instance, products can go out of date. Let's take the most obvious example. Can you bake a bunch of bread 1 week a year and then put it in inventory and sell it the rest of the year? No, because we all know what's going to happen to it. And it turns out that pharmaceuticals have these kinds of limitations. Also, we have polymers. Things go bad. My 3D printing filament actually gets brittle after a while. So there are all sorts of things that we can't just sit around with this inventory and then expect it to be good when we go for it. We also have products corroding or decaying. I think I told you guys about the carbon steel parts that would rust on the shelf. That's just a natural process that's going to happen. Now, you can dip things in protecting fluids, but for some reason, in the end, you're always going to find rust, and it has to be taken care of. And then we have problems with theft. So I mentioned to you about the $30,000 per liter of pigment that we had and how we had to keep it locked up. There are a lot more things that are easier to steal. For example, do you think theft of inventory at a liquor store is a problem? Oh yeah. And in fact, when I lived in Ohio, the liquor stores were owned by the state. And it was amazing how many bottles of expensive liquor got broken when the workers were working in the store. What do you think was really happening? They're stealing it, they're taking it home, and when they get done drinking it, they come back and break the bottle, put it in a dustbin, maybe snap a picture of it, who knows. But it was amazing how much inventory was getting killed off by breakage. They privatized the liquor stores. In other words, put them out to where capitalists could run them. What do you think happened to the amount of inventory theft at that point? Yeah, it dropped. Do you think I'm going to be doing, if I'm owning a liquor store, I'm definitely going to be chasing down every broken or missing bottle, especially the expensive ones. It's interesting how they weren't breaking any of the cheap bottles. It was always the good stuff. Theft, we've discussed in retail, it's really easy. And you can also have people, there is a Canadian maple syrup strategic reserve. Did you guys know that? Have you seen that?
There's a show about it.
Yeah. Okay, so basically, the Canadians, they treat maple syrup like oil. You know, we have a strategic oil reserve. They've got a strategic maple syrup reserve. And how do you preserve maple syrup? Well, it turns out it's pretty easy. It kind of takes care of itself. You just put it in a 55-gallon drum, you seal it up, and you set it in a warehouse. And it's good for year after year after year, not a problem. What happened was, even though this was in a warehouse, not out in a retail establishment, it's in a warehouse, they had some people who were actually taking these drums of maple syrup, stealing them, and selling them on, get this, the black market for maple syrup. And then what were they doing with the drums? How were they faking up the inventory?
They just fill them back up with water or something.
They filled them back up with water. And everything was just fine until someone noticed that some of the drums were rusting. It turns out that maple syrup does not rust carbon steel, but water does. And so after a while, the drums start rusting, and then they start leaking water, and now suddenly we figure out that, I forget how many millions of dollars worth of maple syrup these filthy Canadians stole from their own strategic maple syrup reserve.
In the show, they had a fuel truck that they filled the tank up with.
Oh, cool. If they put the syrup in a fuel truck?
Or like some kind of liquid, tank truck.
Uh-huh. Oh, wow.
But I don't know if that was real life or not.
Yeah, so I got started watching that show, and it was a little too painful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so theft is a problem, and it's not just when it's out where people can get it. And then there's also, I won't quite call it theft. This happened when I was working at a field camp in New Iberia, Louisiana. Field camp is where it's the base camp for oil field operations. And so we had all sorts of things on the shelf. And if people would come in during the lunch hour and they would need a screen or a landing nipple or something else, and they couldn't find any of the warehouse hands, what do you think they did?
Took it.
Yeah, they just went out and took it off the shelf. And that left us with a couple of problems. Number one, the customer didn't get properly charged for the inventory because that was all done through the warehouse people, the charging of the customer. Number two, when the time came when we had someone that actually had paperwork and we went out there and looked for it, it wasn't there. And that can be a real problem when you've got rigs out in the Gulf of Mexico and the rent alone on them was $250,000 a day at the time. That was 1996. So you could have all these problems as a result of this missing inventory, even though it wasn't stolen. Do you know what the solution was? Lock the door. I'm like, they're complaining about it, and I'm like, well, do you guys lock the cage when you go to lunch? They're like, no. Like, well, do you think maybe we should? Yeah. Do you think that put an end to the problem? Absolutely. Now, occasionally a warehouse guy might have to get called out after hours to come get something, but that was worth a call out for us not to wind up short on the stock. And then we have obsolescence. Obsolescence, I think we've talked a little bit about obsolescence. If you think about the early iPhones, are those of any use now? Other than collector's items, are they of any use now? Not really. No one's going to pay for those. And so that inventory, which was once very valuable, because it's no longer the normal now for technology, it's basically obsolete. And so we'll end up having to write that off. How do you avoid writing off obsolete inventory? Well, you don't produce more than you know you can sell. And in fact, if you had to make a choice in selling things like iPhones, would you rather fall a little bit short of the actual demand or go long?
Sure.
Yeah, I'd rather be a little short so you can create demand. You can actually, so Ferrari's really good at this. Do you think you guys right now could go out and place an order for a new Ferrari? No. They have a list of people who are allowed to buy Ferraris. Now, in theory, if they had 5,000 people on that list, they could go out and build 5,000 Ferraris. But they don't. They actually produce less than they know they can sell, which creates this sort of artificial scarcity. What do you think that does to the amount they can charge for those cars? Yeah, so you got to be careful about building too much inventory. On the other hand, for low-end commodity stuff, what about newspapers in the newspaper dispenser? I would always rather have one more paper left over at the end of the day because then I know that I've met all the demand. I'm not trying to create artificial scarcity with newspapers. Questions? Do you think explosives go bad after a while? So I went to see my folks, and I was driving with my dad past the dynamite plant where one of my grandfathers worked. And it's now been converted into this facility where they actually burn old United States Army munitions. And so they get that stuff and they burn it because it's not up to U.S. Army standards. How old is some of the stuff they've been using in the Ukraine? Pretty freaking old. I'm driving past that, watching the smoke come out of the stack, and I'm like, crap, why couldn't they have just sent that to Ukraine? Maybe send them a bill, who knows, right? But according to U.S. government standards, it was beyond its use-by date. So let's talk about the types of inventory demand. And we have two types. We have dependent demand and independent demand. So if you go out today and you order a BMW, that is independent demand. But all the parts that go into building that car are dependent demand. They depend on the purchase of a higher level item. So for instance, when you order that BMW, the BMW has to have an engine. Let's say it's a 3-liter S58. And they have to then, in order to build that engine, they have to have a bunch of parts that go into that. Some of those things are sub-assemblies, which create more dependent demand. So dependent demand is really easy to work with because as soon as someone places the order, it creates that other demand. We don't have to forecast that stuff at all. Whereas with independent demand, it doesn't depend on the demand for another item. And so we're going to have to figure out some way to forecast that independent demand. And when we get into forecast, of course, we're talking about swags, and we don't have exact numbers. Finished goods are an example of independent demand, so the car itself, but also some things have both independent and dependent demand. For example, spare parts for a car. Right now, the engine that's in my car they have been using that engine, or at least some of the parts, for several years now. And so not only are those parts dependent demand driven by production of cars, they're also independent demand driven by spare parts for repairs. So how do we manage this independent demand? Through our sales order process and our sales forecast. If we're doing entirely build to order, then it's easy enough. We're just doing it through our sales order process. And that's exactly what Ferrari's going to do. Do you think Ferrari forecasts how many of a certain vehicle that they're going to sell? No, they know well in advance from their orders how much. By the way, you think if you order the Ferrari today that you'll get it, say, in 3 months? No. So basically, they don't have to forecast sales at all because they've got their orders so far out there. But for other things, for instance, let's say the Toyota Corolla. The Toyota Corolla, do you think it's on the same level as the Ferrari? Absolutely not. And so they've got to figure out kind of in advance how many of those things they think they're going to sell. That gets us into swag territory, expected values, right? And so now we've got uncertainty. So how can we manage the dependent demand? In the old days, we would have called it an MRP system, or Manufacturing Resources Planning System. We've now moved on to what's called the ERP system, or Enterprise Resource Planning. What's the difference? All ERP systems contain an MRP system, but the ERP system allows you to plan things other than just parts. It allows you to plan people and all sorts of other things. In fact, that banner system that we use here at the university, that is an ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning. Have you guys heard of SAP? One of the most popular enterprise resource planning software, SAP. It's a German software, and we implemented all 26 modules at Halliburton in 1999, and we were messing around with this thing, and we're learning how to use it. And each screen, just like in your business strategy game, each screen had a help button. Here was the problem. Whenever we would hit the help button, all the help that came up was in German. Do you know how many people in Dallas, Texas at the time spoke German? Nobody at our plant, right? So, and we didn't have the beauty of Google Translate or any of that. Anyway, so this is one of the more popular ones. Now, what does SAP do? Or any ERP? As soon as you put in that you're going to build the top level item, then what it does is it goes down level by level by level, figuring out what all goes into that top level item. And then it looks at lead times. And it starts, so let's say that your longest lead time item for an order was 26 weeks. So this is our delivery date. So we've got one thing that takes 26 weeks to make. The system will immediately start that item and get it rolling. And then over here at, let's say, minus 18, there's another item that needs to start, and it'll get started. And the whole idea here is that as the system launches these things, that they're all going to arrive at the finish line at the same time. Would it make any sense to have started this part back here? No, you're just going to end up with extra stuff in your inventory. And so the goal is, it's like cooking a meal. Have you guys ever cooked a meal like Thanksgiving or whatever? What time does your family eat on Thanksgiving Day? 5. What time should the turkey be out?
Right at the end.
What time should the let's call stuffing, dressing, whatever you call it? What time should the sweet potatoes be ready? Do you see that the answer is always 5 o'clock? Now, when do you put the turkey in the oven?
Whatever time it needs to be done by.
Yeah, that's going to be your longest lead time thing, isn't it? Now, you're going to have other things like sweet potatoes. They're not going to take nearly as long. And you're going to have other things that are even simpler, like that nasty cranberry sauce that you open the can and you push it out and you can see the line still on it from the can. That takes, what, 2 minutes? Do you see how this works? It's like getting the dinner to come together all at the same time. And if I do silly stuff like starting this stuff early, I just end up with extra inventory for no good reason. Questions? Okay, so that's the MRP or ERP system. The other system is called Kanban. Kanban is a Japanese word that means signpost, literally signpost. But it's come to mean this kind of inventory management system. And here's how it works. Let's start at this end. And in fact, let's talk about 2 different ways that we can handle our demand. There are push and there are pull systems. In a pull system, which is what the Kanban system is, demand pulls things through the system. If I do sales forecasts and create a bunch of work orders based on what I think might happen, that's called a push system. Now, I would always prefer to have a pull system because in a pull system, we don't make stuff we don't need. We don't make stuff we don't need. And so the way the pull system works with Kanban is we have the point at which the item is consumed. And we have finished products there to be consumed, and each container of the finished product has a little card. And any time that the workers take one of these tubs to use the contents, they take the card and they put it in a rack. And that rack is this, it looks like those things that you put the time clock punch cards in that you see in the movies in the 70s. And what we do is we start putting those cards in until the cards reach a certain level. And when they do, that's going to kick off a work order to go create another amount of, and basically replace the amount that we have consumed. Now, in the meantime, we're still going to be consuming additional ones of these items, and so those cards will come back and get put in this rack. Who's doing this? Well, the scheduler will be watching this go by once a day and see if it's reached the level. If it has, he'll take out or she'll take out the number of cards that are associated with a shop order and go create the work order for that. Back in the old days, we had these actual physical shop packets. And the cards would go in with the work order and the shop packet, and as soon as the workers would put the items, the finished goods, in the tubs, they would stick one of those cards on each one of the tubs. I was at Paul Mueller the other day. You guys know what Paul Mueller is? What do they do?
They make tanks for pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, tanks for pharmaceuticals, beer and dairy. That's their big stuff. And they've done away with shop packets altogether. And they've all got like iPads to work with instead. I'm sure they still have a way, if they're using Kanban, to basically keep the cards up with the work though. Now this could be for consumption within the operation, or it could be, as it says here, at the distribution center. And so it could work in either situation. Where we use this at Halliburton was for these things called frac valves. Every pump creation of every pump consumed these frac valves. And so we had them sitting in our assembly area, and as the guys used those valves, they would put the cards in the little thing, and that's how we managed our production of that particular item. Okay, so that's Kanban. It's worth checking out if you get into a situation where you're making something over and over and over again. So now let's talk about inventory costs. And we have our cost of procurement. We've talked about these previously as an ordering cost. And I've warned you about how people typically figure these ordering costs, so you have to be careful with that, but they are real. And we also have our inbound logistics costs. Believe it or not, free shipping is not a real thing. I think you guys have probably already learned that from the business strategy game. Typically, when you're ordering something from a business, you're going to end up paying the shipping on that. And so that's our inbound logistics costs. And then we have our carrying costs. First of all, we have our inventory storage costs. When I first went to work for Halliburton, the first day I was there in Duncan, Oklahoma, they took me into the warehouse. And they were so proud of this warehouse. It was flippin' huge. And it was full of all these racks. And they had these automated things where you could tap in a code, and this little, we'll call it a robot, but it wasn't quite. It would fly down the aisle into this dark warehouse and come back with the pallet that contained whatever it was you were looking for. And they were just so proud of it. At the time, our inventory turns were 4. We got our inventory turns up to 12. And remember that inventory turns are costs of goods sold divided by inventory. Do you think we got our inventory turns up by tripling our cost of goods sold or tripling our sales? No. It was by cutting our inventory by 2/3. What do you think that meant for that glorious warehouse? It ended up, after we did our effort to reduce inventory, it ended up only being 1/3 full. So we have less space there in the building that we needed for that. Now, what does that mean? It means when the time comes to do an expansion of some variety, instead of building a new building, we can just move it into that old warehouse area. We just had to put in lights because it was, after all, it was a dark warehouse. You have to have the building. And not only do you have to have the building, you have to have people. And the more inventory you have, of course, the more likely things are to get stolen and whatnot. Let me tell you about the facility where my dad worked. It was a dynamite factory. I think I've told you about the dynamite factory before. The warehouses had to be air conditioned. Why do you think the warehouses at a dynamite factory would be air conditioned?
For the stability of the dynamite.
Yeah, it's not for the comfort of the workers. It's to maintain the proper humidity level in the dynamite. Because if you let that stuff sit around in a Southwest Missouri summer, with the kind of humidity we have here, it gets wet, and wet dynamite does not work as well. Do you think it's costly to air condition a warehouse? Absolutely. So the less inventory they had on hand, the less air conditioning they had to use, the lower that cost would be to hold on to the inventory. Can you think of another reason you wouldn't want to carry a huge inventory of dynamite? 1966, the place blows up, and there's flaming bits that land. Back then, the magazines, which is where the name for a dynamite warehouse is magazine. The magazines were just open buildings. They weren't covered up with anything. And so the hot stuff would come through there, and the inventory all literally went up in smoke. Not in a fire, in a big old boom. And so this is another reason you might not want to hold inventory. It's potentially dangerous. And it's not just dynamite that's like that. Can you think about like gasoline? And there are lots of things that are dangerous to hold large quantities. There was actually a situation, and it was in the Northeast, where they had a molasses factory. Do you guys know what molasses is? It's like hot, it's sticky, gooey, sweet stuff. And they actually had a huge inventory of molasses. The tank broke, and the molasses flooded the town. Now, if it were water, you'd think you might be able to swim and avoid dying. Do you think that's a realistic possibility with molasses? No. So a bunch of people died. Why? They had too big of an inventory of molasses. It's dangerous. We also have the cost of capital. We've discussed that we have to have money to be able to put this stuff on the shelf. At the very least, we have our firm's cost of capital, or we might be borrowing this money in the short term from the bank to put that inventory on our shelves. And so that's another reason we would want to carry less. Now, one reason we might want to carry more would be the shortage or stock out costs. And in fact, have we been through this slide? I think I've talked a little bit about, we've talked about lost sales before, and about how until the advent of the app and people picking stuff up at the curb, Walmart really didn't have any idea about its stockouts. Does Amazon know about stockouts? Yeah, when people go and it's like, sorry, this isn't in stock, they have a feel for that. What I'm familiar with is the expediting charges on replacement items. So when we were at the grocery store, we had milk. If we ran out of milk, we had to have what was called a hot shot, and it cost us more transportation-wise than our regular milk shipments because they sent it in on a small truck, and they sent it specially just for us. When I was in the oil field, we also used what we call hot shots. And so if you could plan your stuff accordingly and you had the inventory on the shelf, you might be able to use a cheaper form of trucking like LTL, less than load. We might be able to send it via SIA. But if the inventory runs out and we've got to do it now, then we would end up hiring a guy called a hotshot driver, and he would bring a flatbed lowboy trailer, and we would strap our stuff to his trailer, and he would drive it down to where it was to be taken out into the Gulf. And so that kind of transportation probably costs somewhere between 3 and 10 times as much. My folks have a hotshot driver that lives just up the hill from them. Man has a lovely home and lovely vehicles. Why? Because hotshots are expensive. Questions? Most expensive hotshot I was ever involved with was getting a part for the nuclear power plant, $30,000 to $40,000 for a private jet to fly one part. Now let's talk about outsourcing inventory. Hardly ever when anyone starts a business do they think, yeah, I want to start a business because I'm really great at handling inventory. And so you might not be, and your company might not be the best at handling inventory, but you can actually outsource your inventory to someone else. My favorite example is right here in Springfield, Missouri. Did you guys know that Kraft macaroni and cheese is made here in Springfield? If you buy Kraft macaroni and cheese anywhere west of the Mississippi River, it comes from Springfield, Missouri. If you buy it anywhere east of the Mississippi River, it comes from a plant in Illinois. Now, the next question is this: do you think Kraft has their own warehouse? Apparently, Kraft has figured out they're actually not very good at managing inventory. And so what Kraft has done is they have outsourced the handling of their inventory to a company called DHL. Have you guys ever heard of DHL? What are they typically associated with?
Usually it's trucks.
Yeah, so they're shipping, right? They're like a global kind of UPS based out of Germany. If you order stuff from Europe, it usually comes DHL. If you get something from Israel, it comes DHL. But DHL here in Springfield actually runs the Kraft Macaroni and Cheese Warehouse, which is located in the Springfield Underground. You guys know about the Underground? It's an old limestone quarry, and they emptied out all these areas getting the limestone out, and then they looked around and said, you know what, we've got a lot of really great space here. And it's consistently, I think it's 55 degrees year round. And so you can actually cut down on the cost of storing stuff that needs to be kept at a cool temperature. You can cut down on that cost by putting it in the underground. And that is exactly where all the Kraft macaroni and cheese is kept. And I went and visited this place. It's amazing. Have you guys seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? And that last scene where they're taking the ark into that huge, huge warehouse that just seems to go on forever? That's exactly what the Kraft Macaroni and Cheese warehouse looks like. It's just amazing. Anyway, these people are excellent at taking care of inventory. And so when Kraft gets an order for macaroni and cheese, all they do is let DHL know, and DHL takes care of pulling it out of inventory, completing the transaction in the system, getting it on the truck, and getting it sent to wherever it's going to go. The warehouse people at DHL get paid $18 an hour to start, or at least they did 2 years ago when I was there. And they get indoor parking year-round, and they, except for having to wear a coat basically all the time because it's 55 degrees in there, they seem to be really, really happy people. The only thing I could tell that wasn't quite right about them is they're all very pale. It's because there's no sunshine down in that place. So that is an example of outsourcing inventory. So Kraft doesn't have to build their warehouse. And another example of people that are outsourcing their warehousing is Highland Dairy. They have an ice cream factory here in town. And in the beginning, the ice cream factory had its own warehouse. By the way, what do you think ice cream warehouse is like? It's flippin' cold. I think it was like something like minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the same as minus 40 Celsius. So they took us into that, and then they brought us back out into the it's like 0 degree freezing holding area, and it felt warm by comparison. It was amazing. But they had all this warehouse space, and then people started eating more ice cream. So they needed to expand the plant, but they were landlocked. And so instead of picking up and moving outside of the city limits where there was more space, what they did is they outsourced the holding of their finished goods to the freezer space at the Springfield Underground. I'm not exactly sure which company is running theirs, but then they used that old warehouse space to create new production space. And so it's actually fairly common to outsource inventory. So we've mentioned before if you use Amazon fulfillment, basically you are outsourcing not only your warehousing, but your fulfillment to them. So if you were just outsourcing warehousing, you might have to actually go there and get the stuff yourself. But if you do it with Amazon or someone like DHL, they take care of that for you. Now, there is a chance that outsourcing your inventory might increase your costs. Here's what I would tell you about that. It's possible that the sticker price on outsourcing the inventory might look higher to begin with. But by the time you calculate in all the lost and damaged stuff that your non-professional inventory people are doing, it might actually end up being cheaper. So if you ever find yourself in the position of trying to figure out whether or not to outsource inventory, you need to look at all those costs. Too often we just look at, well, we got two guys getting paid $15 an hour, that's our entire cost, and that's just not true. It might increase your cost, but it definitely reduces your control of the inventory. Do you think it's possible that a warehousing company might go bankrupt? Yeah. And while they were working through the bankruptcy process, do you think it would be possible that you would not be able to get to your inventory? Yeah. So there's some possibilities for you to have problems there. There's also a possibility that they will steal your inventory and sell it on their own. So these are definitely things that you need to watch out for. It reduces your control of your inventory. I think the craft example is a good one though, because as craft people, any day of the week that they want can go just across town and look at all that inventory and can make sure that it's still there and that it's being properly handled. So I think you can mitigate these losses of control. So how do we keep up with our inventory? Well, we have what are called audits and cycle counts. Inventory, we said it has economic value, and we know that it must be tracked. You guys may have noticed around the university that every piece of equipment like this has a property tag on it. Why do you think that is? Yeah, it's an economic asset. And what do people, in fact, I can tell you, you can see the property tag on the overhead projector. When I first came here, every Super Bowl about that time, one of these things would go missing. People were stealing our projectors to have Super Bowl parties at their house. Do you think they brought them back? No. And so that's why we have to track these things. And inventory is the same way. Inventory has value, we have to track it. So how are we going to go about doing that? Well, we have to make sure that it's in a proper environment. We talked about maintaining proper temperature and humidity. And we also want to try to prevent theft or damage. Let me give you an extreme example of maintaining a proper environment. Do you guys remember when the COVID vaccine first came out? Do you remember what temperature that stuff had to be stored at? It was like, they've gotten better, but it was really, really, really cold to begin with. Do you think that you have to, if you're storing something that requires a temperature like that, do you think you need to keep logs? Yeah, and when we were doing heat treating, which is of course the opposite problem, we would keep they had a paper disc and it had a needle that would record the temperature. And so for every heat treating that we did, we had evidence of what the temperature had been during the process. And so if you're doing something that's extraordinarily critical like that, you're probably going to have to be keeping these records. So your inventory not only exists in a physical sense, but it's also in the books. And we have to make sure that these things match. And I've already told you at least a couple examples of why they might not match. Let's talk about, we've already talked about theft. Do you think that there's also the possibility that people would accidentally break inventory? Yeah. Do you think people who accidentally break inventory are likely to report it? No. And we always have to stress to our employees the importance of doing that. And of course that means that you can't punish them or they won't tell you that they broke something. Does that make sense? When I worked at the grocery store, I started as a custodian, a janitor, for $2.85 an hour cleaning toilets and other things. One of the things that we did though was we got our cleaning supplies off the shelf. If we didn't properly record that, do you know what it looked like was happening? Looked like people were shoplifting paper towels. I've never seen anyone actually shoplift paper towels, but that's what it looked like. So it's important to keep those records. And so we've got to make sure that this reality, the physical reality, matches what's in the books. So how do we go about doing that? We're going to be doing audits and cycle counts. So cycle counts are more frequent than a full audit. And the daily count is going to be less than 100%. I worked at a facility in Ohio, and every single day, the ERP system was designed to spit out 12 random part numbers to be checked in the inventory. When you have this report with the 12 part numbers, do you think you put the number of parts on there that the system says there are, that you send the guy out into the warehouse with? If I send you out somewhere with something that says part 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's supposed to be 6 of them. What is the most likely number I'm going to get back from you? 6. So I do not put the expected amount on the sheet. I give the warehouseman a sheet with the part numbers, and I say, go count these for me. And then when the warehouseman comes back, I enter those into the system, and it spits out the discrepancies. Now let's talk about what happens here. Do you think, what do you think is more likely to happen? That we're short on something or that we're long on something? Short, because of theft, accidents, that sort of stuff. That's the more likely outcome. And so when that happens, then we need to do an investigation. The most common cause that I found of things being short in inventory was that they simply had been misplaced. And so then you end up going on some sort of squirrel hunt where you're out there looking for this missing part. And usually you could find it. Someone had got it out and then put it back, but they didn't put it in the right place. It's kind of like being at the library where they tell you not to put the books back because they want them to be back in the right place. But sometimes people don't get that. What do you think could cause inventory to be long? Okay, so a miscount. So the warehouseman goes out there and counts 7 when there's actually 6. That's possible. What else?
Just incorrect shipments from the warehouse.
Yeah, so what if someone sent us, we ordered 6, and by accident they sent us 7. And when we're putting stuff in, what is the warehouseman likely to do? Oh yeah, we got 6, right? And so put 7 on the shelf, put 6 in the system, and we end up long that way. I remember the first time I ever had to sign in an order. I was at the grocery store, and it was the guy that brings the Twinkies and crap. And he basically had this long list of all the different things and the quantities written out beside. And he basically just said, here, sign this. Do you think it was possible that he might have over or under delivered based on just not even being malicious, just by accident? Absolutely. So we could have ended up with extra Twinkies or Ding Dongs that day simply because I didn't know enough to go through and count all this crap. Now let's talk about a manufacturing facility. Let's say you're manufacturing automobiles. Why might you be long on parts?
Something's missing.
We forgot to install something on a car. Example, airbags. Do you think it's possible that your car right now is missing an airbag and you don't know it? Absolutely it is. And so if you are only counting, let's say that we were only counting the airbags once per year, and we figured out that we were 1 airbag long. What does that mean we have to do? Yeah, we have to do a recall and inspect every single car that was made since the last time we had the right number of airbags in our inventory. Now, you might say, wait a minute, one airbag, what are the chances that that one car will get into an accident? Gentlemen, I'm going to tell you, it's damn near 100%. Whatever car you forgot to put the freaking airbag in is going to end up in a wreck. It happens like that. So you got to do the recall. Now, knowing what you know, how could we reduce the severity of any such recall? We count the airbags more frequently. And so for things that are going to create this kind of potential for a huge, by the way, do you think recalls are cheap? No. Not only do they cost us money, they cost us reputation. You guys read about Honda or someone, like the Takata airbag recall. Totally killed the reputation of a few brands because they were always held out as these paragons of quality, and then they got these crap airbags. Okay, so what do? We count that thing more frequently. You know what? If I were running a car manufacturing facility, I would be watching the freaking airbags every day because I want to, in fact, I want to be able to catch the fact that we're missing that airbag before those cars reach the railhead so we can look at those cars before they even leave to go out to the dealers. Okay, so how often we do that? Well, we do the small counts just every day. And then we, for these others, for every quarter, and every half year, and every year, so of course it's just once per quarter, we do a 100%. Now, the problem with doing a 100% count is that during the course of normal business, you're going to have stuff that's going into inventory, and you're going to have stuff that's coming out of inventory. So in order to do an actual good wall-to-wall count, you have to freeze transactions. You have to say no one can put anything into inventory while we're doing this, and no one can take anything out. Do you think does that lead to good productivity? No. If we're building cars, we're continually pulling stuff out of that inventory, right? And we're continually receiving shipments in. And so typically these wall-to-wall counts will happen, say, overnight. So if you're running production on first and second shift, you want to do this wall-to-wall count during the third shift when you can kind of freeze the transactions in and out of inventory. In the end, if you don't find the missing inventory, what do you need to do?
Write it off.
Yeah, you got to write it off, which means that, so we're going to go from 12 to 11 to match our actual on the shelf, and then we're also going to, when the word write it off, we're writing down the value of that asset. How's that going to impact our income statement? It's going to lower. If it's a $20 item, our income's lowered by $20 now, right? Our revenue. Okay. And we just talked about that. So now let's talk about the economic order quantity. So we said we've got these order costs, where every time we order something, it costs us a fixed amount of money. And it doesn't matter whether we're ordering 200 or 1,000. And so from that perspective, you might think, oh, well, it's better to order 1,000 at a time because then I can split that cost over 5 times as many items. What's the downside of doing that?
House 1,000 items.
Yeah, you've got this cost of carrying those things. And so the idea behind the economic order quantity is that it balances these two things and creates the optimal point to minimize that total inventory cost. So now let's talk about 2 different kinds of order systems. We have the continuous order model, which is where a fixed order quantity is ordered whenever the inventory level reaches a predetermined safety level. Let me draw what that looks like. So in the course of our work, we're going to, let's still say we start with full inventory, and what's going to happen? Your inventory is going to drop over time as you consume it. And then, at some point, we are going to order, and let's call this the safety level. And this, we're going to go ahead and order at this point right here. But that inventory is going to continue to fall while you wait for that order to be fulfilled. And then it'll be back up here. And we go through this over and over and over again. What happens if your order doesn't arrive in time? Yeah, you get a stock out. And so it depends on how reliable your supplier is, how high this safety level has to be. The higher or the more volatile your supplier is in their delivery times, the higher that safety level needs to be. Now, in this case, we've got this where we hit this level and then we order the same amount every time. And that fixed order quantity that I would order would be this economic order quantity. So that's one way to go about it. The other way is that we place an order after a fixed period of time, and that's called the periodic system. The way my wife and I manage our groceries is a periodic system. Every Saturday night, we go through and we look at what we have. So we try to keep 4 frozen pizzas. That's what I like to have, 4 frozen pizzas. If we only have 2 in the freezer, then I order 2. What happens if we only have 1 in the freezer? Order 3. So with the periodic system, the order quantities change, but the order timing doesn't. With the continuous order model, the timing changes, but the quantity does not. Does that make sense? So what are the assumptions for this economic order quantity? Well, first of all, it assumes no safety stocks. Well, we know you're insane not to have a safety stock. So there's the first assumption violated. The second one is that no shortages are allowed on deliveries. So I used to work in this plant where we were making these suspensions for trucks. And one of the parts that we got were these airbags from Goodyear. They were made at a plant just a few miles away. Sometimes when they would do their production, they would screw some of them up. And they would catch them, and they would send us the shipment short. And they would tell us, look, we owe you 60, we've only given you 54. Do you think we went ahead and accepted the 54? Absolutely we did, because we needed to keep production up. Economic order quantity, the basis assumes that you're not going to do that. So there's another violation of the assumptions. Then they also assume that demand is uniform. Can you think of anything that demand is uniform for? Milk? I would argue that over time, the demand for milk has... When I was a kid, when I was working in the grocery store, almost every grocery order that I took out had a gallon of milk with it. How rare is that today? Yeah, nice try though. Other things that you think might have a constant demand. Gasoline. That's a good thought. However, what happened during the COVID pandemic?
People drove more because gas was cheap.
Okay, why was gas cheap?
People were driving less.
People were driving less. Oh yeah. Oh my goodness, that first few days of lockdown, you could get out on the highway and be driving like 90 miles an hour, not see another soul. Oh, it was sweet. Okay, so people drove less, gas got cheap, people drove more. So the demand, and let's say let's not even worry about the pandemic. Let's talk about seasonality. When do most people throw their rugrats in the minivan and take a vacation? Summer. What happens to gasoline demand during the summer? It increases. What happens to the price of gasoline in the summer? Yeah. I'm telling you, I have yet to think of, and we could say oxygen, but I know this, when I'm on the treadmill doing 4 miles an hour at that 10 incline setting, I'm consuming a whole lot more oxygen than when I'm just sitting on my butt watching television. I have yet to come up with a perfect example of constant demand. So in other words, there's another assumption violated. The lead time for order delivery is constant. Do you think that's always the case? No, man. When we were running, when times were hard and we had very little work in the shop, if we got an order, we could jump right on it and crank it out. And you might have got it in 2 weeks when you normally would have been waiting 6 weeks. So there's another problem. And it doesn't consider stockout costs, which we know are real. So why am I telling you this? EOQ, it's like the best thing we've got. It's terrible, but it's the best thing we've got. Does that make sense? It's got flaws, and you need to understand that it's not perfect. So here's our formula. EOQ is equal to the square root of 2ds divided by C. D is your annual demand. S is your ordering cost. That's the cost that you incur every time you place an order. And C is your carrying cost. So let's take a look at basically how we're getting to this. If you look at your annual ordering costs, the bigger your order quantities, the lower your annual ordering costs, because you're making fewer orders with larger quantities. Does that make sense? Now, when you look at your annual carrying cost, it goes directly with your order size. The bigger your orders are, the higher your carrying cost is going to be. If I put those two curves together, the line and the curve, the line and the red curve, I get the blue curve, which is our total cost. And what we notice is that there is a minimum at the bottom of that blue curve. That is where our total annual inventory cost is minimized. That is the economic order quantity. And so visually, that's how we are arriving at this thing. And it's minimizing our cost of inventory by balancing those things against each other. So here we have an example. Our raw material costs $22.50 per ton. The forecasted consumption is 5.75 million tons per year. The annual carrying cost is 40% of the acquisition cost. In other words, 40% of $22.50 per ton. And the ordering cost is $595. Every time we place an order for this stuff, we have to spend $595. So we need to put these into the variables that we talked about earlier. We've got our demand of 5.75 million tons. Notice that it is not in dollars. The demand is in the units, whether it's parts or tons or gallons or whatever it is. And then we have our order cost of $595, which is S. And then our carrying cost, which is our cost per unit to carry. And that cost per unit, they said, was 40% of $22.50. And so what we're saying is that our carrying cost per year per ton is $9. And so we throw that all into our formula there, and then we have 2 times 5.75 million times our 595 ordering cost divided by our $9 carrying cost. And we do all that, and then we hit the square root button, and it gives us 27,573.135 tons per order. Do you think you're actually going to be able to order 27,573.135 tons? Most likely not. Most likely, this is gonna be in terms of 1,000 tons or 10,000 tons. And so you'll have to adjust that to account for the way that your supplier actually sells this stuff to you. Now, I could ask you one more question. And in fact, this is a good exam question. Would you like to hear that again? This is a good exam question. I could be a little tricky, and I could say, how many orders would you place per year? I give you the same information, but instead of asking you what the EOQ is, I ask you, how many orders do you place per year? How do you calculate that?
Forecasted consumption divided by the EOQ.
Okay, so we're going to take that 5.75 million tons and divide by the 27.5 or 27,573 tons per order, and that would tell us the number of orders that we place per year. Now, do you think that I would be so evil as to include the EOQ as one of the possible answers to that question? Absolutely, I would. So you need to read carefully.
What was that formula again?
Okay, so what we're gonna do, if I ask you for the number of orders, you're gonna take that annual demand of 5.75 million, and you're gonna divide it by the EOQ. And that'll tell us how many orders per year. So the important thing there is to read the problem and see what I'm asking for. Am I asking for EOQ, or I'm asking for the number of orders per year? Questions?